The early history of the Codex and the story of how and when it becomes the dominant book form is tied up very closely with early Christianity, because we don't know exactly why people may have preferred the Codex, and we don't know all the details involved, but one thing we know for sure is that in the very earliest period, and I'm talking about, say, the 2nd and 3rd century AD, the Christians favored the Codex overwhelmingly, whereas the general book culture thought that the book roll was the more elegant and proper form for literature. Christians, we know, overwhelmingly went for the Codex, and more particularly for the writings that they most prized. It seems to me just as likely, if not more so, that Christians chose the Codex because they wanted to be different, because they wanted to make a statement, because they wanted to mark off their texts in some kind of physical way, distinguishing them from non-Christian copies, perhaps, a kind of semiotic purpose, so to speak. We know that Christians preferred the Codex, as I say, and particularly for their scriptural writings. That's the additional factor. It wasn't simply a preference for the Codex, but particularly a preference for the Codex for the writings that they most revered, that they treated as scripture. If we look at other things such as theological treatises, or liturgical works, or Christian magical texts, or things of that nature, of the material that's extant, about 65% from this 2nd, 3rd century, about 65% or so are codexes. So about a third are written on rolls still. But the Christian scripture texts are almost entirely codexes. Let's talk about how you would construct a codex. I don't have any papyrus here, but let's pretend that this is a sheet of papyrus. The papyrus would be prepared with one layer of fibers laid vertically and another layer of fibers laid horizontally. It was on the horizontal side, if you were making a roll, you joined the horizontal sides together in a continuous length, and you wrote on the horizontal fiber side because the writing was easier to do that. Writing on the other side with the vertical fibers, writing across the fibers, so to speak, even if you pumiced it very smooth, it was still a little more irregular and was considered a little more difficult for writing. You could do it, but it was a little bit more of a chore. But with a codex, one of the first things that changes is that you are writing on both sides of the writing material. You take a sheet of papyrus, you fold it in half, and you use all four what become pages. Remember, when you go to the shop, you don't get sheets, you get a length of writing material. So you bring the writing material home and you have to cut it into sheets to form the sheets that will form the folios for the codex. So you've cut them into sheets, you're now ready to fold them up and begin writing on them. Let's assume that you decide, I'm going to go with individual sheets and then construct the codex after I do the writing on it. So you start off with one folded sheet of material, 4 pages of writing, put that down, go to the next one, 4 more pages of writing, put that down. But as I say, you have to be careful that you don't get them mixed up. Otherwise, you could jumble up the text that you're writing. One of the things you would probably do then that you don't need to do for a roll is perhaps to mark the individual folded sheets with something like a page numbering. But they weren't so much page numbering always. In some cases, they were just numbering of the individual folded sheets to keep them in the proper order. Okay, so suppose you've gone through and you've written your text, and what you have then are a sequence of folded sheets. You still have to make the codex. There are 2 or 3 different ways you could do it. One way is to take the individual folded sheets and lay them in the proper order on top of one another. And you could do that with as many as you needed. Let's stop with 3 just to get on with the experiment. But we actually know that there are examples that survive of what are called single gathering codexes. That's what I mean is a gathering is 2 or more sheets of folded material stitched together. We actually have single gathering codexes that are as much as 50 or more sheets of papyrus in a single gathering. So imagine 50 sheets of papyrus, and papyrus would be, actually ancient papyrus, not that much thicker than modern day paper, writing paper. So 50 sheets of it put together and then stitched together to form one book. Now, I've only got 3 or 4 sheets here, but it becomes immediately apparent one of the difficulties of doing that is that the inner sheets stick out slightly from the outer sheets. And if you've got 50 sheets of material, they're going to stick out quite a lot. So if you want to have a nice, elegant, blunt edge, what you got to do is then trim off the sheets to form a nice, blunt edge. The problem there, of course, then is that the sheets on the inner side of the gathering can be considerably smaller, maybe 1 inch or 2 narrower than those on the outer edge. And that affects how much writing you can get in, it affects the elegance of the book and so on. Another way you could do it is say, well, I don't like the idea of having to trim off those inner sheets and that's cumbersome. So I'm just going to do this way. I'm going to take individual folded sheets, number them so that I can have them in the right order, and place them in the proper order. Let's take, here I've got maybe 8 or so. You've got individual folded sheets, and what you can do is just simply stitch them together running this way with a stitching this way. So not one fold, each one of these, so to speak, almost is its own one sheet gathering. And for that, again, you don't need to estimate how much material you need. If you miscalculate, you just go and buy some more, make some more folded sheets and add them on at the end. Great. So you have a kind of concertina type book. The obvious problem with that, of course, is that if that binding breaks, the whole thing falls apart like a deck of cards. A third way you could do it is to say, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take 2 or 3 or 4, let's say, folded sheets and make a gathering comprised of just those sheets. So 1, 2, 3, and let's take a 4th one. And that will be my gathering. That way I can avoid having sheets, the inner sheets sticking out very far from the outer ones. I'm going to take, say, these 4 sheets and stitch them together and form a gathering. And then I'll take another 4 sheets and make them a gathering, and another, and another, and another. So I have individual gatherings that are stitched together to form a quartet of sheets stuck together. And then I'm going to take these multiple gatherings, so to speak, multiples of your 4-sheet gatherings, and then stitch them together. That eventually is the form of the book that triumphed, and of course if you know or if you look closely at a modern bound book today, you'll find that's still the way they're made. Individual gatherings of usually 4 folded sheets put together to form the modern book, which are themselves joined together with stitching and then a binding holding the whole thing together. We know that the Codex technology was still in the experimental stage in roughly the 2nd and 3rd century AD, as I say, because we have examples of all 3 of these types of Codex construction being operated. And obviously, if people had solved the problem of how best to build a Codex, people wouldn't still be stumbling around at the time experimenting with different methods. By the way, if you want to see examples of early examples of serious Codex construction and using these different techniques, one of the places I've mentioned I would recommend if you get to is in Dublin to the Chester Beatty Library, because in the famous collection of biblical manuscripts, early Christian biblical manuscripts, some of them from the late 2nd and on into the 3rd century, we have all 3 types of Codex construction illustrated.